The champagne flutes clinked around her like wind chimes in a storm she couldn't touch. Sarah Martinez adjusted her emerald dress and rolled her wheelchair closer to the corner table, watching couples sway to the gentle jazz filtering through the garden reception. At 34, she'd built a tech empire worth millions, commanded boardrooms filled with intimidating executives, and graced the covers of Fortune and Forbes. But here, surrounded by the romantic blur of her college roommate's wedding, she felt invisible in a way that had nothing to do with her paralyzed legs and everything to do with the assumption that someone like her couldn't possibly want what everyone else seemed to have so effortlessly. She'd almost declined the invitation. 3 months of physical therapy after her latest surgery had left her exhausted, and the thought of navigating another social event where well-meaning relatives would pat her shoulder and speak in that particular tone reserved for inspiration made her stomach turn. But Emma had been her closest friend since freshman year at Stanford, back when Sarah was still walking and dreaming of changing the world through technology rather than proving she belonged in it despite her wheels. The accident had happened 6 years ago, a drunk driver running a red light on a rainy Tuesday evening. One moment she was driving home from a late investor meeting, mentally rehearsing her pitch for the next day. The next, she was waking up in Echo with titanium rods in her spine and a future that looked nothing like the one she'd mapped out. The company she'd co-founded was still in its infancy then, bleeding money and hope in equal measure. Everyone expected her to step down, to focus on recovery, to accept the limitations that seemed to come standard with her new reality. Instead, she worked from her hospital bed, conducting video conferences with venture capitalists while learning to navigate the world at 3 feet lower than before. She turned her company into an accessibility tech powerhouse, creating software that helped millions of disabled individuals integrate seamlessly into digital workspaces. The irony wasn't lost on her as she'd found her greatest professional success by embracing what others saw as her greatest limitation. But success, she'd learned, was a lonely companion. Dating had become a minefield of awkward encounters and painful assumptions. Some men fetishized her disability, others treated her like a charity case, and most simply looked through her entirely. She'd stopped trying 2 years ago, convincing herself that independence was preferable to the exhausting dance of proving she was worthy of love. "Mom, can we sit down? My feet hurt." The small voice broke through her brooding. A little boy, maybe 7 or 8, was tugging on his father's jacket sleeve near the dance floor. The man was tall and lean, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the slightly rumpled look of someone who dressed up for his daughter's sake rather than his own. "Just a few more minutes, buddy. Aunt Rachel specifically requested this song." The father's voice carried the patient tone of someone accustomed to negotiations with tiny humans. Sarah watched as the boy shifted from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable in his miniature suit. She recognized something familiar in his posture, the way he stood slightly apart from the other children, observing rather than participating. When she was his age, before the accident, she'd been the same way at family gatherings, more interested in watching the adults navigate their social rituals than joining the other kids in their games. Without really thinking about it, she rolled her chair toward them. "Excuse me," she called softly to the father. "I have an empty table over here if your son needs somewhere to rest." The man turned, and Sarah felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. His smile was genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that suggested he wasn't just being polite. "That's incredibly kind of you. I'm David, and this is my son Marcus." "Sarah," she replied, extending her hand. David's handshake was firm without being performative, and he made direct eye contact in a way that felt natural rather than calculated. "I was just thinking this little guy looks like he could use a break from all the festivities." Marcus perked up immediately. "Are you the lady with the cool wheelchair? I saw you earlier and wanted to ask if it has any special features, but Dad said not to bother strangers." Sarah laughed, the sound surprising herself. "It's not bothering me at all. And you're right, it does have some pretty cool features. Want to see?" For the next 20 minutes, Marcus peppered her with questions about her chair's mechanics while David watched with an expression that shifted gradually from polite interest to something deeper. Sarah demonstrated the chair's various functions, explaining how she'd had it customized for both professional and personal use. Marcus was fascinated by the technology, asking increasingly sophisticated questions that revealed a mind hungry for understanding. "Marcus is quite the engineer," David said proudly. "He's been building robots since he was 5. "Really? I started my company designing assistive technology. We're actually working on some pretty exciting robotics applications." Sarah found herself genuinely engaged in a way she hadn't expected. "What kind of robots do you build, Marcus?" The conversation flowed naturally from there. David, she learned, was a high school physics teacher who'd been raising Marcus alone since his ex-wife had decided motherhood wasn't compatible with her acting ambitions 3 years earlier. He spoke about his son with the kind of fierce love Sarah recognized in the most dedicated entrepreneurs she knew, are the ones who believed in their vision even when the rest of the world couldn't see it yet. As the evening progressed, other wedding guests drifted toward their corner table, drawn by Marcus's animated descriptions of Sarah's wheelchair modifications and David's easy laughter. Sarah found herself at the center of a warm circle of conversation, fielding questions about her company and sharing stories about the early days of building her business. For the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about what she couldn't do or how others might perceive her limitations. When the band announced the last dance, Sarah felt a familiar pang of exclusion. This was always the hardest part, watching everyone pair off while she sat alone, a reminder that some experiences seemed permanently out of reach. David must have noticed her expression change because he suddenly stood and extended his hand toward her. "Sarah, would you do me the honor of being my dance partner?" The question hung in the air like a soap bubble, beautiful and fragile. Sarah's first instinct was to deflect with humor or politely decline, but something in David's eyes stopped her. This wasn't pity or performative kindness. This was simply a man asking a woman to dance. "I should probably mention that I'm not exactly light on my feet," she said, her voice catching slightly. David's smile widened. "Good thing I'm not much of a dancer either. We can figure it out together." He took her hand and gently guided her chair toward the dance floor. Other couples made room naturally, without the exaggerated gestures of accommodation Sarah had grown to dread. David knelt beside her chair and took both her hands in his, moving in time with the music while she swayed in rhythm. It wasn't traditional dancing, but it was theirs, intimate and joyful and perfectly imperfect. Marcus appeared beside them, taking Sarah's free hand and spinning in circles around her chair, his earlier fatigue forgotten in the magic of the moment. The three of them moved together like they'd been practicing for years, drawing smiles from other guests who seemed to recognize something beautiful and unexpected happening before their eyes. As the song ended and the evening wound down, David helped Sarah gather her purse and wrap. "I know this might be forward," he said, his voice slightly nervous for the first time all evening, "but Marcus and I were planning to check out the robotics exhibit at the Science Museum next weekend. Would you like to join us?" Sarah felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but they were tears of possibility rather than frustration. "I'd love that," she said simply. Walking toward the parking lot, Marcus skipping between them, Sarah realized that the loneliness she'd carried for so long had lifted without her noticing. She'd spent years building walls around her heart, convincing herself that independence was the same thing as strength. But maybe, she thought, watching David help Marcus into the backseat of their car, the strongest thing she could do was allow herself to be seen, not as an inspiration or a charity case or a business success story, but simply as a woman worthy of love and partnership and the ordinary magic of family dinner conversations and weekend museum visits. The invitation hadn't been about pity or heroism. It had been about recognition, one human being seeing another and deciding they wanted to spend more time together. In a world that often reduced her to her most visible difference, David had somehow managed to see everything else first. 3 weeks later, when David nervously asked if she'd like to make their museum visits a regular thing, Sarah said yes without hesitation. And 6 months after that, when Marcus started calling her Sarah Mom and David started leaving spare coffee mugs at her apartment, she realized that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with the simplest question, "Will you be my date?"